It's really a remarkable collection of musicians, and I have to remind myself every day just how incredible they are, and how lucky I am to work in this organization because, you're just capable of doing anything and such a great spirit as well. And you see that in the performances. I think you feel that, especially when we're on the road on tour like you saw the band.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Everything Band, a podcast that features conversations with composers, conductors, and performers of music for winds and percussion. My name is Mark Connor. I'm a composer and educator, and each week I have the good fortune to speak with and share the stories and wisdom of musicians and leaders in the band community. The Everything Band podcast is a proud member of the Music Teachers Development Podcast Network. The Muted Network provides support in the form of audio-on-demand programming designed by and for music educators. You can find more information about our network at mutedpodcasts.com. Before we begin, I'd like to thank all of you for listening. I appreciate your time and hope that you are finding value from these interviews. I rely on word of mouth and social media to bring the show to new listeners. If you think you knew one or two people who might find these interviews useful, please let them know about it. You can also help by following me and sharing posts on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Remember, help your students live up to the best that is in them through music. And now, my next guest, Colonel Jason Fettig. Hi, Colonel. How are you?
I'm doing great, Mark. Thank you. How are you?
So, Colonel Fettig, can you tell everyone, let's do this. Let's have you introduce yourself and tell everyone who you are.
Okay. I am Colonel Jason Fettig. I am the 28th director of the President's Own United States Marine Band. And a little bit about my background. You talked about origin stories and where we came up from. I joined the Marine Band actually as a clarinet player. I started playing clarinet when I was in second grade, which is a little bit early for that age to start an instrument. My mother really wanted me to start playing an instrument, and when I chose clarinet, I chose it simply because it was black, because black was my favorite color. I had no idea what it sounded like. So it was a little bit unusual, I think, that I started on clarinet and I stuck with clarinet all the way through my music education. And played it all the way through high school, and decided my senior year in high school that I wanted to be a musician professionally. It didn't occur to me until then that was something that I could do or that I would end up doing as a profession. So I started late, choosing late that I would end up being a musician, and went to college for music education and clarinet performance at that point.
Wow. So even in just that short little bit, I have a couple of questions for you. Was Mom a musician?
Mom is a singer, yes. Not a professional musician, but a church singer and somebody who loved music for her entire life, yes.
As someone who teaches fourth graders how to play clarinet, I wonder about a second grader. That's a big instrument for a second grader, and those holes are hard to cover. How did that go?
It was a little bit challenging. I remember being fairly small. I was kind of a slight child as well, and with small fingers, and my fingers would barely cover the tone holes at that point. And in fact, I couldn't even hold up the clarinet when I was at this age. I rested the clarinet on my knee to play it because I wasn't strong enough to hold it up with just my thumb rest. And it's a habit I actually developed poorly for a good portion of my education because I continued to hold the clarinet on my knee for years afterwards, even after I didn't need to. And I had to break that habit later on, but it came from the fact that I started playing so early when I was so small.
Now, of course, you'd get a neck strap for it.
Yeah, I never played with a neck strap. I stopped playing professionally before the neck strap became fashionable. And if I were continuing to play these days, I think I would use the neck strap. That's a much better ergonomic situation.
For sure, especially for smaller kids. Boy, that must have been like Squeak Central when you were first starting. Holy cow.
It probably was. There are many times when I almost quit, I think, early on in those early years, because it's frustrating when you're starting an instrument for the first time. It's difficult. And when you don't sound good right away, and you don't feel like you're doing the right things, you don't necessarily want to stick with that, and it takes some perseverance. And I do remember several moments over the first 4 or 5 years of playing before I really got comfortable with it, where I almost stopped. And I think I shudder to think what would have happened if I had done that, if I had quit, when knowing now what I know, and as far as knowing where my career would lead me, starting with the clarinet.
Yeah, absolutely. I know I tell my youngest clarinet players that the instrument is constantly out to get you. It's a very fickle instrument. It's got to be sort of perfectly manipulated.
It does, but I did fall in love with it. After I got comfortable playing the clarinet and I started to have some success, I loved the sound. I loved the repertoire that was available. It really suited me well. And in fact, my earliest teachers told me that the clarinet was a good instrument for me. My embouchure was well suited for it. And the fact that I chose it before I even knew what it sounded like was a happy circumstance that it ended up being an instrument that I ended up falling in love with.
Do you remember any of those early teachers and what they taught you about music and life?
Oh, I remember every teacher I ever had. My first clarinet teacher, my first serious clarinet teacher was a woman named Carlene Delova, and we still are close today. We still remain friends. And she was just a marvelous teacher, not only for what she did as far as setting my fundamentals as an early clarinet player, but more importantly, encouraging me and showing me how beautiful music can be and why we play in the first place. I think if I hadn't had that kind of education, if it had been mostly about technical stuff and technical achievement, I don't think I would have ended up being a musician. I really needed to be set on a path where I was taught what it meant to be a musician that had nothing to do with the clarinet. It only had to do with music. And the clarinet was simply my tool. And Carlene was so wonderful in setting me on that path. And the teachers that I had afterwards continued that education and deepened my love for music. And the clarinet was just the vehicle that I was using for it.
Yeah, no question. I think when we teach kids, it's so much about imparting the other things, not the technical skills necessarily. That comes later, but it's that joy, that encouragement, what music is. I think that's a great answer.
Yeah, I think that there's two aspects to early music making that are so important. The first is just feeling like you're achieving something and working toward a goal that you can feel good about yourself, that you're doing something that's difficult and you're doing it well, which of course takes hard work, but it also is great for self-esteem for a young musician, and I certainly felt that. And then the other thing is, just like we talked about, just learning what music is and the power of what music can do. And how it can impact, a young mind and open up modes of expression. Learning how to express yourself in music is a tricky thing, but it's, I think, an essential part of a young education.
So you mentioned that in high school you decided to become a professional musician. Do you remember what the catalyst for that was, what that moment was?
Yeah, again, it was my teacher. My high school band director was a man named David Bresnahan. And again, I am still close with Dave. We used to call him B for Bresnahan. We stay in touch. He's retired now, but I'm so honored to call him a friend after he was a mentor of mine. And my high school band experience was phenomenal. I grew up in New Hampshire, southern New Hampshire. New Hampshire does not have a huge music program statewide, but our program at Central High School in New Hampshire was one of the most respected in the state. And it was because of Dave Bresnahan and his teaching and his energy and his creativity. And I had a really marvelous experience all 4 years that I was there. I was afforded a lot of opportunities to do things in music. And he continued that ethos that Carlene instituted in me early on, which is that music is so important and so powerful and is something that should be cherished. And I learned that in my high school band experience. And by the time I got to my senior year, it was a combination of feeling a level of accomplishment as a clarinetist and feeling like this is something that I could do and that I could be successful at. But more importantly, just having that kind of epiphany that music was central to my life. And it was something that I wanted to continue to do every single day. And that other careers I had considered at that point were not going to be nearly as impactful or moving to me or as fulfilling to me as it would be to be a musician professionally.
So you ended up entering college as a music ed student, you mentioned. Was it clarinet performance as well?
Yeah, not entirely immediately. I went to college to be a music educator. I wanted to be a teacher. I was really excited about that. It was only after I got to UMass Amherst, in this case where I did my undergrad, where about a year in, my teachers encouraged me to add a double major and to get a performance degree as well as my music ed degree. And I thought that would be very good. I didn't know what I was going to do or what I wanted to do at that point, but I thought it was a good opportunity to be prepared for any opportunities that might come my way professionally. And that if I ended up being a teacher, wonderful. If I ended up having the skill to perform professionally, then that was something that I was open to as well.
So you went to UMass for your undergrad and you switched to performance. Did you ever end up getting that music ed degree?
I did, and I almost didn't complete it, and that's because of the Marine Band. I won my Marine Band audition the summer after my coursework was finished, right after I had finished at UMass, but I had not yet done my student teaching. And we could talk a little bit about that process, but winning the band audition was a little bit of a surprise to me, and I was nervous that I was going to have to report for duty and not be able to finish my education degree. But luckily, they let me defer my enlistment, and I was able to do my student teaching and finish my degree, which was very important to me.
Yeah, we should unpack that from the start then, because that's a big moment, both winning that audition and then deciding that you wanted to finish that degree. I imagine that's a decision not everyone would make.
Maybe so. I do think that there have been some occasions when you have a big opportunity that is presented and it ends up trumping something else that you were pursuing. I think some people would make that determination that this is more important. I wanted my cake and wanted to eat it too. I knew at that point when I accepted the position with the Marine Band that I likely was not going to be teaching, at least right away. But after all of the work I had put into the education side of my degree, I had earned the performance degree, but I was so passionate about teaching and passionate about the coursework that I had done as a music education major, I would have felt awful to not complete that degree. And I was looking forward to student teaching as well, that being the kind of culminating experience for music educators in their education. I wanted to experience that, even though I wasn't going to jump right into the education field.
Sure. So I guess we should talk about that first before we do the Marine Band stuff. So why did the band let you have that extra time, and how long did it take you to finish up that degree before you actually joined the service?
It took me one semester, so it was the fall semester that I was taking an extra semester after my 4 years of coursework to do my student teaching. And so I won the audition in August of 1997 and then student taught in the fall of that year and then enlisted in December of that year and reported for duty the following year. So, here in the Marine Band, we try when we find new people to come join the organization, they're all at different stages of their lives. Sometimes they're working professionals that have already graduated and are at another job. Sometimes they are still in school or getting their graduate degree, or in some rare cases still getting their undergraduate degree. And we know that's a very important part of their lives and their education. So wherever is possible, we try to work with individuals to let them finish whatever chapter of their life they're in then before they report for duty here in the band. And it was the same back then when I joined. There was a real sense of from my superiors wanting me to be able to finish that chapter of my life before I came and started this new chapter in the Marine Band.
Mm-hmm, that's terrific. So how far out, and we're going to kind of jump ahead here, how far out are you, do you audition then, if that's something that you do?
Yeah, it depends on the position, but generally we have a set number of people in the Marine Band, and so we don't audition unless there is an opening. So once we know that someone's going to leave the organization or going to retire, they tell us in enough advance notice so that we can start an audition process so that the gap between when they leave the organization and a new person checks in and gets trained is not too wide, because we need everybody in our organization to execute our mission. So it's about a 9-month process typically. We will audition 7 or 9 months outside before a vacancy occurs. And then once we've identified a winner, then it takes several months to go through the process to enlist them in the Marine Corps for service with the band before they can report for duty. And then there's a period of training that we execute here before they can actually start playing. And so it does take a little bit of time to make that transition.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Well, let's get into that then. So, I've had other military musicians on. We've talked about that audition process. I had a really terrific conversation with Francis Frankie, who's a bugle musician with the Old Guard. And he took me through their audition process, which I think is unique among all of the service bands.
I'm sure it is, yeah.
And so what's the process like then for an audition with the Marine Band? What would, if a director out there or a musician out there is going to audition or have a student audition, what would they expect?
Well, the process is very similar to what one might expect for a civilian orchestra. We are looking for the very best musicians we can find. Now, of course, there's added layers to serving in the Marine Corps and in the Marine Band that other qualifications need to be met beyond the musicianship. But first and foremost, it's about finding the best musicians. So our process is similar to what you'd see in those orchestras. We have people will come and audition, and we do it behind a screen. So the first round is anonymous. All we hear is the musicianship. People will play for about 4 to 5 minutes in that first round. And one of the unique things is that we accept applications from everybody. We don't pre-screen applicants as long as they meet the requirements of age for enlistment in the Marine Corps, which needs to be between the ages of 18 and 35. And I think that's important because, sometimes in the civilian world, you could not even get invited to certain auditions that you may be qualified for based on your resume or based on your education. And I think it's important for people to be given that opportunity. In fact, when I auditioned for the Marine Band, I would not have been accepted likely for another like ensemble who was pre-screening. I was still in my undergraduate degree. I didn't have any other professional experience at that point to speak of. I don't think I would have been invited to the audition, and it was an audition that, much to my surprise, I ended up winning. So that happens sometimes. We get very talented young people just as often as we get older, more experienced people winning our auditions. So that first round is designed to get to a place where you have a small pool of qualified candidates. So you might have 100 people that come to this audition. We're going to end up whittling that down to about 10% of whatever that total number is. So after that first round, we'll end up with about 8 to 10 candidates who will move on to the next round. Then after that, they go through an interview process so we can find out a little bit more about them. We do weigh and height people so that we know that they are, if not already compliant with Marine Corps weight standards, that they are close enough that they can reasonably get there, which is a requirement for us. And some questions about background so that we know that they could get a security clearance, which is also essential for our service since we are the President's Own. And then we go through the rest of the musical rounds. So we'll have another semifinal round, and we'll be able to hear those folks play a longer, more substantial repertoire, ask them to change some things, see how flexible they are in their musicianship, get to a final round where we're down to maybe 2 or 3 candidates. And then at the end of that process, I will, in consultation with our committee, I will select a winner, offer them the position, and hope that they accept.
This open audition, so there's no pre-screening. Do you ever have anyone that comes in that just shouldn't be there?
Yeah, I think that happens quite a bit. There are often people who will come who are ultimately not qualified, and it's pretty clear in the very opening moments of an audition whether someone's in the ballpark or not. But, also as somebody who feels strongly about music education, I think that there is no substitute for going through the process of an audition.
Sure.
Just the experience of being nervous and being, judged and preparing and practicing for an audition. I think it's so important, and I think it's a really important opportunity that we extend to people, even if they're not qualified, to have that 4 or 5 minutes to play in that environment, to have that experience. I think that's a really important part of people's education, and it's something that we can offer.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, I mean, the New York Phil isn't going to invite everybody in the world to come audition. But yeah, it's really interesting that you do that. I think that's fascinating.
And it takes some time, but it's time well spent, I think.
So you mentioned a couple things, and there's a lot to talk about with the Marine Band. And there's a lot of different directions I could go, but the interview ultimately is about you. And so I'm wondering about, excuse me, early morning here in the Midwest. So can you tell me about maybe your early experiences and as a musician, and then maybe your journey to becoming the conductor, the director?
Yeah, I took a pretty unusual journey to becoming the director of the Marine Band. In fact, if you had told me 20 years ago that I was going to be the director of the United States Marine Band, I would have laughed in your face. Just the idea of being, a colonel in the United States Marine Corps and the director would have been so foreign to me. Mm-hmm. My education, I was very lucky, as we talked about earlier, just to have such wonderful, nurturing teachers who set me on a path, not only as a clarinet player where I could get good at what I was doing, to know what to work on, to have the opportunities to really have people push me to be the best I could be as an instrumentalist, but equally important just to develop that passion for music. So those experiences, I think, were kind of instrumental to my success. I think both of them were equally important to me ending up where I ended up here today. The other part of it, frankly, was just being in the right place at the right time, and being prepared for opportunities that presented themselves. When I graduated, or was about to graduate from undergrad, I was touring with a group called the American Wind Symphony, which is a wind orchestra out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, run by a man named Robert Boudreau, who's a very, very well-known conductor and a commissioner of works. He's been doing it for 60 years. And I was lucky enough to be a part of this summer touring group. And while I was on that tour, I saw an advertisement for a position in the Marine Band by happenstance. I was eating breakfast at one of my friend's kitchen tables while we were taking a break, and I spilled milk on this piece of paper, and I turned it over, and it was the Marine Band newsletter. And that newsletter was advertising a position for clarinet. And the audition was a month away. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I know about the Marine Band. They're famous, but I've never thought about actually being in the Marine Band. Maybe I should take this audition. So I sent away from the music. I spent a couple weeks just practicing like crazy on this music and seeing if it was something that I could do and I was qualified for. And this is the interesting part. At the end of that process, I decided that I was not qualified and that I was not good enough to take the audition, and I wasn't going to go and embarrass myself. So I decided not to go. And at the very last minute, my parents encouraged me to buy a plane ticket and go take it, because you never know what can happen. And it wasn't very expensive to get down to Washington, D.C. And why not take a chance? I had prepared the music. So at the last minute, I bought a plane ticket. I flew down to Washington, D.C. And at the end of the day, I had won the audition. I could not believe that. But I think the reason I won the audition, I look back on those days and I think, how lucky was I to be pushed to take that opportunity and then to win that position. But I think I was relaxed about it because I was simply taking advantage of an opportunity that was presented, and there was nothing at stake. I had done my work. The only thing I needed to do was not be afraid to fail. And I needed to be pushed to do that. But I remember being in that audition and being relaxed, just saying, here's what I do, and if it's good enough, great, and if it's not, that's not going to be a surprise to me. And that helped me be a better musician on that day, and I won the audition. So I came into the Marine Band, and I was going to I ended up really loving the band. Within the first year, I knew this was a place I could spend a career. I loved the history of it. I loved the connection that we have with American music and American culture. I loved, of course, the quality of playing, which was just off the charts. I had never experienced anything like that in my entire musical life to that point. This was my first professional experience, and it was the most amazing experience I could possibly have imagined. And I was going to play clarinet, and I wasn't going to teach anymore. I had done some conducting when I was in high school and in college, and I was interested in that. But now I was going to be a clarinet player, and I was happy with that. And 3 years into my career, one of our assistant directors retired, and Colonel Tim Foley, who was one of my predecessors in this job, decided at that point to hold an open audition for an assistant director, for an assistant conductor vacancy, and that he declared that anybody in the organization could audition. Doesn't matter how junior or senior you were. And so I'm 3 years into my career, and I remembered just taking that chance to audition on clarinet for the band, and I thought, well, maybe I should just throw my hat in the ring. I have some conducting experience, not nearly at this level, but maybe I have some natural talent. And the worst that can happen is I have an opportunity to conduct the Marine Band in an audition. How bad could that be? So I threw my hat in the ring for that, not expecting anything. And at the end of that process, for whatever reason that Colonel Foley had at that time, he decided to select me to become an assistant director in the band. And that was in 2001. And then here we are, 19 years later, and I have the privilege of being the director of the band, but never could have planned for it. And I just feel like I'm so incredibly lucky to have been in the right place at the right time to seize these opportunities.
Well, I think you know what they say about luck. It's your preparation meeting that moment. So I'm sure that you were ready for it in whatever way.
I think the hardest part for all developing musicians is that that sounds great in theory, and that is absolutely right. But you never know until you actually do it, until you actually succeed, if you're doing the right things. But that's why the courage is so important. You have to put yourself out there, and you have to take a chance, because if you don't do that, you never will know. And in my case, luckily I did rise to that standard each time that's happened here. But I could have very easily have made the opposite choice and decided not to take a chance. And I'd be in a very different place in my career right now. And I can't, it's hard for me to think about that knowing what I know now.
I think that's really important. I think I experienced that pretty much myself too, is that whenever I take a chance, the worst that's going to happen is someone is going to say no. But
right.
if you never take a chance, then the answer is always no. You'll never get a yes.
That's a great point.
Yeah. So I'm going to name drop a little bit here because I've had a couple of folks on the show, and they relate to your story. And one is I had Mike Colburn on, who is also a predecessor of yours, and he worked his way up to the conductor of the President's Own from the euphonium section.
Yep.
And the other person is my wife plays every summer at the Eastern Music Festival with Jerry Schwartz, the conductor.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And he worked his way from the trumpet section. Leonard Bernstein tabbed him as a conductor, and that's how he got his start. And I think it's really interesting that someone, a conductor before you, and that we see this story repeated, recognizes someone in the ensemble who has those leadership qualities.
Yeah.
And so I want to ask you then, what do you think makes a good leader for the band directors who are listening?
Yeah, and first of all, let me say that Colonel Mike Colburn is my immediate predecessor and a really important mentor of mine. And Colonel Colburn, Mike was one of the people who I think did recognize me early on and recognize some of the potential I might have had as a conductor. And I owe as much to him as I do to Tim Foley for encouraging me to take these opportunities, and then to work alongside him for the 13 years I did as an assistant director, and to learn from him was one of the reasons why I think I have any success right now as director, succeeding him as director of the Marine Band. So a shout out to Colonel Colburn for everything that we've been able to do together and everything that he's done for me in my career. And Jerry Schwartz is actually a good friend. And, Jerry and I have worked together on a number of occasions, to include winning an Emmy together for the work we've done on the All-Star Band series. Jerry has that All-Star Orchestra series, and he and I worked together on the All-Star Band series, with 3 programs featuring the Marine Band. And I'm so glad to be able to call Jerry a friend, and what a remarkable conductor and musician himself.
He's a wonderful man. He
really is. So kind, and we've developed a great relationship over the years. So to your question, the question was, what makes a good conductor for the musician? I think, first of all, this interesting kind of development of musicians, performers, instrumentalists who then move on to conducting. I think that's common, and it's very common in our organization, because I think it's important as the technical requirements are of conducting. The leadership part is as much about kind of culture and intuition as it is about technical skill. You can take all the leadership classes you can find in the world, and you can learn a lot of theories about leadership and do this and do this, and here's your checklist of how to make good leadership decisions. But it does not work in a vacuum, and it does not work on paper. I think any theory or any kind of practice you would put into place as a leader or as a conductor has to be informed by your own intuition. And that intuition comes from your own personal experiences. So if you just started out as a leader, which is unusual, and were never led yourself and didn't know what it felt like to take direction, to be beholden to someone else's decisions, you're going to be a terrible leader, because you don't have the empathy that you need to know what it feels like to be on the other side of that equation. And so when people come from within organizations, when they've done the yeoman's work, they've done the hard work of an organization, musically or otherwise, they understand what it takes to do that job. They understand the expertise that it takes, and the skill and the preparation. And so when you're leading from a place of empathy. You're leading from a place of, I know I've walked a mile in your shoes. I know what you need. I know what I needed when I was in your position, and I'm going to do my best to give that to you. So I think that, in a nutshell, I think that's what makes a good leader, somebody who's thinking about what it takes to be led, what the responsibilities are of people who are leading, to give to their constituents, to give to their musicians, to help them, put them in the place to do their very best work. That's the kind of central, that's the nucleus of what good leadership entails, I believe.
It's interesting, that empathy, it sort of ties back a little bit to how we started talking about maybe the technical stuff isn't the most important thing first. The first thing is, again, the person, nurturing that person.
One of the hardest things for especially very educated musicians to do is to not be in control of, kind of your output, your creative output. And when you're in large ensembles, when you're in a band or an orchestra, you are kind of at the behest in many ways of the conductor, of the leader, making musical decisions for the whole. And I've found in my experience that ensembles are at their best when you try to collaborate and give as much control as is possible to musicians. Now, some of that can be done, is harder to do when you have, 60 people all playing together. But I think, at least in the luxury of the Marine Band, our musicians are so incredibly gifted and so good at playing together that a lot of it can be delegated. A lot of it can be turned over and handed over to them in collaboration. And I do think that as much as we can do that for each other, it's a much more fulfilling process for everybody. Then people aren't just cogs on a wheel. They are an integral part of the creative process. And they feel that. And when people feel valued and they feel like they have some say and some control and some input to the whole, their enjoyment goes up and then they do better. I think that the level of happiness and passion that you have is inversely or is deeply connected to the level of accomplishment.
I was going to ask about this. How do you empower? Now, it's much different when you're teaching middle school or the conductor of the Marine Band, of course, but how do you empower your musicians? Because, a lot of the literature you do play a ton of literature, but a lot of the stuff you play is very traditional.
Yeah, we're all over the map, and I think purposely so. I mean, we play a lot of traditional music because we are America's oldest professional musical ensemble. There's a tremendous musical legacy there that is important for us to uphold and to celebrate. Whether it's the music of Sousa or traditional band pieces or old school transcriptions. But we do a lot of new music too. And we could talk a little bit about that later on as far as just, feeling like it's important to continually contribute to the state of the art today. And I try to find balance between those two sides of what we do and what we provide as a resource. But as far as empowering musicians, which is, I love the way that sounds. I mean, that's exactly what I think is at the center of this effort. Whether it's students or whether it's professionals, everyone needs to feel empowered. Some days it's more challenging to achieve that for everybody than others. But if it's a central kind of tenet to somebody's teaching or somebody's work as a professional conductor in my world, I think that's the way to go. I think the way that we do it here is we try to offer as many opportunities for our musicians to be creative in their own right as possible. That certainly happens in chamber groups, whether they're coordinating their own chamber recitals or they're picking their own repertoire or choosing who they want to play with for different projects or opening up opportunities for them to come up with new projects that are completely their own, that serve the mission of the band. All of that is central to kind of the way we operate in the Marine Band and our artistic identity. And in the areas where we're all doing things together that are prescribed, if I'm choosing repertoire for a concert or for a ceremony or for a White House commitment, I try to do everything I can to just make the process of music making and rehearsing as collaborative as possible. Even if it means that sometimes it is in opposition to some of the ideas that I had in a vacuum in my own office or my own study. If the musicians come up with something together that's better or more personal or more heartfelt than what I had in mind, I try to allow that space for that to be there. Because ultimately the musical product ends up being better because of that investment and that empowerment that the musicians feel.
So you mentioned chamber music earlier, and I wanted to ask you, everyone knows the band, but what other ensembles do you have? What other ensembles do you run for the President's Own?
Well, one of the interesting things about the Marine Band is that we are one full unit. We have 154 people in this organization. About 25 of them are professional support staff members. So we have full-time professional librarians, recording engineers, communications and marketing staff, which is fantastic to have people as well schooled in their profession as our musicians are in theirs. So about 130 of them are musicians, but we have a pool of musicians. This is very much a Marine Corps ethos where we have one group of musicians that essentially does everything, no matter what we need. We're all here in support of the President of the United States and the Commandant of the Marine Corps and the American public. So I don't have individual ensembles like some of my counterparts do in some of the other services, a dedicated jazz band, a dedicated rock band, a dedicated chamber groups or ceremonial band. everybody does everything. So we have probably, we can formulate 30 or 40 different ensembles from within the President's Zone, depending on what the needs are. Some of those are regular ensembles that get together. We do have a rock, pop, country band that we put together. We do have a big band that plays many times a year. We have a Latin band, and a mariachi band, and an Irish ensemble. The cool thing is that all of those ensembles are made from the classical musicians that audition and join the band. So we have a trumpet player who also plays guitar. We have a bassoon player who plays tin whistle in the Irish ensemble. We have a violist who plays country fiddle. Everybody who comes in has just a tremendous range of interests and skills. And when they see a need musically, a lot of people will just step up to learn how to do that. They will work on augmenting their skill set to fulfill the mission. And so, if we hire a classical trumpet player, but he or she happens to be also a great jazz musician or has an interest in that, we utilize that as well. And that person may play, second cornet in a band concert, and then turn around and play lead trumpet in the big band. So I'm so grateful to have this breadth of skill within the organization that allows me to basically do anything I need to do musically at the behest of the president. Any request that comes in, almost without exception, we can fulfill musically. And our capabilities in that way continue to get better and better even every year as our musicians come in with more and more diverse skill sets.
Has there been a request that's really off the wall or off the path that you've like to share? Has there been something that's...
It's interesting. There are some requests that we get sometimes that I think are musically not as advisable. And one of my jobs as music advisor to the president is to try to offer those opinions where I think we might want to go in a different direction depending on what's being requested. But we have stretched the limits on a number of occasions, to include the hardest part for us is world music, is getting in, Middle Eastern styles or Eastern Asian styles of music that we don't necessarily play the traditional instruments. And when appropriate, we will kind of westernize the idea. We'll get these authentic tunes and we'll play them on Western instruments. But if we can make it sound reasonably authentic, then we'll do it. If it's way out of the box and it's going to be a thing that might potentially offend a visiting dignitary, I will advise against it, to make sure that we're always diplomatically doing what we need to do. I think one of the things that we can't do is bagpipes. I don't yet have anybody who plays the bagpipes. So when we've had rare requests for bagpipers, we've had to send them in another direction. But almost everything else has been achievable.
That's not necessarily a bad thing, right?
It depends on how well the bagpiper plays, I think. I wouldn't want to throw one of our clarinet players on a set of bagpipes and ask them to do something unless they had some lessons.
Yeah, that question of authenticity is interesting, because I think, it's important that we're always being authentic to ourselves and to the music that we're playing. And so it's interesting that you brought that up.
Yeah, authenticity is a fundamental aspect of musicianship.
Yeah.
We are all individuals. You don't want to do something for a living that's central to your core and do it dishonestly. And so, it's always an interesting balance between us as individual musicians and what we do together as groups, whether it's in a school setting, school band, school orchestra, or even all the way up through to the professional ensembles in our military. We're all individuals and we're all a team as well. And I think there's a way to do both. I think there's a way to be an authentic musician and play music authentically while still being part of a team, part of a greater collaborative effort. And it's a constant kind of shift. You're constantly moving those pieces around as you do your jobs. But I feel like in my position, I feel like I can be an authentic musician. I felt that as a clarinetist, and I certainly feel as a conductor. I'm maybe not your traditional military band conductor. I'm a little bit more maybe eccentric in some ways, not kind of buttoned up and straight up and standing at attention all the time. But I've allowed myself to do that, to be the authentic conductor I am, even when I'm in a military uniform, because I feel like that's the best way I can make music. And I'm certainly capable in more ceremonial and formal settings of being more traditional and more ceremonial. But I don't feel like I need to be like that all the time. And I found that I found a way to fit that into my role as a military band conductor.
The other thing I want to ask before we move along here is about the string musicians. Are you capable of putting a full orchestra?
We have a chamber orchestra. There's an interesting side story here. The Marine Band used to have a full symphony orchestra, but they were all band musicians. Oh. So up until the 1950s, everybody in the band who had come into the band in the early part of the 20th century with less than 10 years of experience had to double on a string instrument. So if you were a baritone euphonium player, you needed to learn how to play cello, and the inverse was expected as well. So, for instance, Sousa was a violinist by trade, but when he came into the band, he also played some other wind instruments as well. So up until the 1950s, if you were a string instrument player, if you were a violinist, you would be expected to learn how to play clarinet or flute or oboe. So we had a full symphony orchestra up until the 1950s, and it was actually not too bad. The men, it was all men in the band at that time, they got pretty good at doubling on both wind and string instruments. And then a gentleman named Albert Schoper was a director in the mid part of the century. He stopped that doubling requirement, and then they reduced the orchestra down to a chamber orchestra and hired full-time professional string players who would only be required to do that. And the reason it was a chamber orchestra is because that's the ensemble that fits neatly in the grand foyer of the White House. We have exactly the number of string players we need to create a chamber orchestra for the White House, which is where they perform most often when they're not playing for the public. And that's the way it's been for the last 70 years.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting. See, I'm glad I asked. Mm-hmm. Is there a full orchestra in the military?
There is not. Several of the bands have chamber orchestras like we do. A lot of what the military orchestras do is strolling strings. So in the Air Force and the Army, for instance, they have the strolling groups that do entertainments and dinners. Occasionally, the strings from the various Washington, D.C. orchestras are put together to create, for major national events, to create kind of an inter-service orchestra, but no a military ensemble has a full symphony orchestra.
Jason, let's talk about your primary role, serving the president at the White House, and what's that like, and what are some of the better, I don't know if you have any anecdotes that you can share or things that you might want to tell the people who are just sort of curious about this aspect of your mission.
Well, yes, the mission to provide music for the President of the United States is our primary mission. We have a relationship with the White House that goes back to 1801, when the band moved from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C., when it first became our capital. And we moved down here with President John Adams, and it was the Adamses that first invited the band to the White House on New Year's Day, we believe, in 1801, to play in the still unfinished executive mansion. And to be perfectly honest with you, the reason why we were the ones invited as the Marine Band is because we were the only band in town. We're by far the oldest band, and we were the military musicians for the better part of the 19th century. We were the only game in town, and so we developed that relationship with the presidency that has continued to this day. And it's a pretty big part of our mission. We perform more than 200 times a year at the White House. We do over 1,200 commitments a year. That's including public performances and on tour and all the ceremonial functions we do for the Marine Corps, Arlington National Cemetery funerals, of course, which is a huge part of our mission. But the 200 plus times a year we're at the White House, we are the primary musicians at the White House. And that experience is really amazing. I have to say that every time I have a chance to go to the White House, even after 23 years of service here, I still can't believe that this is what we get to do for a living, and to use music to represent the country in this way. And the audiences in the White House are not like our tour audiences where you're playing for 3,000 people. The audiences in the White House are small. It's a very intimate kind of music making, but of course it's a very important type of music making on behalf of our country, both for the important artists and authors and scientists and luminaries who come through the White House to be honored by the president, but also for the foreign dignitaries. I mean, the musical diplomacy that we are able to employ in our front row seat at the White House is one of the most moving things that I've been able to see over my time in the band, as has been our relationship with the presidents that we've had. And we've had a wonderful relationship because of that long history with every president we've served. I've been here since President Clinton, so I've had a chance to have a relationship of some sort with President Clinton, President Bush, President Obama, and now President Trump. And one of the common things that has run through all of these gentlemen and these first ladies is how much they love and appreciate what music means to the White House, especially through the work of the United States Marine Band. I've had some personal experiences with all of these presidents, but my directorship has occurred under President Obama and President Trump. And I do remember, around the time of the last inauguration, the day before that inauguration, we had an opportunity to go over to the White House to say goodbye to the Obamas, which is a tradition of ours to say farewell to each president and first lady as they depart. And normally it's kind of an informal affair in the grand foyer after a reception. The president and first lady will come over, say a quick goodbye. But in this case, we had not been able to find a time to do that. And at the very last minute, the president's staff called me. This was the day before or 2 days before the inauguration, and asked if we could come over to say goodbye to President Obama. And I said, that would be wonderful. How many people can I bring over to the White House to say farewell? And there was a pause, and then the staff member said, all of them.
Oh, that's cool.
So for the first time that I can remember, we actually had the entire Marine Band go over to say farewell to the president, and he spent some time with us and made some very moving remarks just about how he'd been all over the world, and nobody does what we do better than what we do here in the United States. And it was a very proud moment to say farewell to our Commander-in-Chief as before we welcomed our new Commander-in-Chief. So that was a very, very memorable moment. And then the very next day was the inauguration, and my first inauguration as director. And I can't explain to you what it feels like to stand on that box right below the presidential dais on that international stage to provide the soundtrack for this incredible national event, this change of power, this historic kind of ceremony that is central to our democracy. The whole day is kind of a blur. It was cold, and I was out there for about 5 hours. So I do remember some parts. But just the opportunity to provide music on that level and provide music for that kind of occasion, and to hear the band, I'm so proud of this band, to hear them play as well as they did. Everything you hear on that inauguration from 2016 is live. And it's an 80-piece band, and it's about 28 degrees outside, and they're playing their hearts out for the American people, for our presidents. And that, just standing there and taking that moment in, and I'll have another opportunity to do this again in January for another inauguration. That was a really surreal moment. That was akin to all the times that we have an opportunity to be in the White House and just be in a place that so few people have a chance to be, let alone to be able to provide music for that space.
Yeah, it's incredible. I'm just trying to imagine what that must be like, and I really can't. It's it's just one of those things. You just watch it from afar, and you sort of live vicariously through your words here.
It's a rare privilege, and it's a kind of music making that is very special because you can have very intimate moments with people, whether it's a president and a first lady, members of the staff, or in our case, I could tell you dozens and dozens of stories of luminaries, authors, dancers, singers, actors, directors who we've had personal musical moments with that have been so special. I can tell you one story if you want.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
One that stands out to me, and it was a very private moment. So now I'm sharing it with your entire audience. We were having an arts and humanities medal ceremony, and we often play for these ceremonies at the White House, and we often will tailor our music to the guests. So if the president's honoring someone, if there's music associated with them, we will bring music that specifically honors those guests, so that each event is tailored to the event, to the music that we're playing. And in this particular event, Meryl Streep was being honored with an Arts and Humanities Medal for her work in film, of course. And so we had put together a medley of some of the music from her most famous films, some love themes from movies like Sophie's Choice and Out of Africa, Bridges of Madison County. And we were going to play this. Now, you have to remember that in the White House, when there's 500 guests in there, the orchestra can be heard, but it's kind of a backdrop. It's kind of background music to the general din of the event, and it's just kind of providing a sound tapestry. It's not necessarily a concert. But every once in a while, things will stop, and it'll be almost like a performance for people. And every once in a blue moon, something special happens, like what happened with Meryl Streep. So we were warming up. The gates had not opened. The event had not started. It was just the orchestra in the grand foyer, no one else, just a few people, staff members running around preparing the house for the event. And as we're warming up, in walks Meryl Streep, just by herself. And she walked over and got a glass of champagne, and she's just standing 10 feet from me, just waiting for the event to start. So I looked at the orchestra and I said, maybe we should play. And so they pulled out this medley that we had of her music from her films, and we hadn't gotten through 2 notes of the opening oboe solo to Sophie's Choice. Da dee da da. And she put her hands on her face, and she immediately recognized the music, and she put her glass down, and she got emotional. Just listening to this. And so we played this entire movement, the entire suite of multiple soundtracks to these films, ending with Out of Africa. And she came over and she was very emotional. And she said, that was so special to me. And at first I thought that it was special just because we had honored her with music from her films. But she immediately said, you don't understand how important this was, because all of that music was from my friends, and we lost some of them this year. Marvin Hamlish had just died, the composer of Sophie's Choice, just a few months prior to this. And John Barry, the great film composer who wrote Out of Africa, had died the year before. So she was sharing with me that this was so special because she had had this creative, artistic friendship with these men, that it was the friendship was as important to her as anything else, and that we had honored them by playing this music for her. And this was a private moment, nobody around except for Meryl Streep and the Marines of the orchestra and myself, just between her and us. And I'll never forget just how emotional and how special the music made that moment between us.
All right, Jason, I could ask you literally hundreds of questions about the Marine Band, but we don't have all day. So I guess I would be remiss if we didn't talk about a little bit about Sousa and the march, because I have a lot of band directors who listen. And so what do you think? I mean, what are your best tips? I know we have lots of thoughts on how to perform marches. From the time we play in bands, we hear, the advice. But what do you think about performing marches?
Now, this project that we've embarked on since I became director, when I became director, one of the things I wanted to do was to re-record all the marches of John Philip Sousa. Clearly, his music is central not only to our band as a former director and our traditions and history, but of course to us as Americans and as American band masters and band musicians. Sousa is an icon. He's a hero. So I thought it had been about 40 years since we had done recordings, and we didn't have a set of recordings that was kind of indicative of the way we play these Sousa marches now, today, and the way that we've been informed over the years of scholarship and research to play them the way that Sousa intended them to be played in general. So this Sousa project we've embarked on has been such a joy. It's been a lot of hard work for my staff to go through and edit these marches and record them, and for the band certainly. As a former colleague said when I talked about this project taking shape, he said, "Well, is the band going to be okay doing that 130 plus marches?" I said, "Yeah, they'll be fine." He's like, "Well, that's a lot of offbeats for the horns." So there have been a lot of offbeats for the horns, but they have done a marvelous job documenting these marches one more time. We're at volume 6 now. It was just released this week. So there'll be 7 volumes total. And we're almost done. So next year will be the last volume, and we will have completed this document of these marches. And many of the scores and parts to these marches are available for free download. Well over 100 are available for band directors to add to their libraries and to perform these marches the way that the Marine Band and the way Sousa would have performed them. Everything is marked in there for you, so you can listen to the recordings and you can play the pieces with your bands and have them be as authentic as I believe they can be. So as far as tips on performing Sousa, I mean, one of the things that I've learned through my time here in the Marine Band, and certainly as a conductor and director now, having conducted nearly all of the Sousa's marches and many of them hundreds of times, is that the drama that is inherent to a Sousa march must be brought out. The reason a Sousa march is special is because he was brilliant at creating musical drama. And when you play them and alter them the way that is shown in our editions, it even enhances the drama even more. I do think sometimes that we tend to take Sousa marches a little too fast as well. I think that they work really beautifully in the 118 to 122 beats per minute realm. I think any faster than that, you lose some of the nuance and some of the beauty in his melodies and harmonies that he writes, and some of the rhythmic inventiveness that Sousa puts into his marches. So I would encourage band directors who are listening just to take it down a notch and just take a little bit more time with some of these marches. If you're doing one as an encore or kind of at the end of a program, you can juice it up a little bit. Sousa did take his marches as fast as 132 at times, but I think a lot of them work really well at good old 120 or 122. And then after that is just to create that dynamic contrast. When you have a chance to play piano, play as soft as you can. When you have a chance to play fortissimo without playing loud and without playing so loud that it distorts the sound, really dig into those articulations and really, especially the dogfight, the break strains. It's a true fortissimo, good accents, really deep sound in the low brass, and with a lot of fire and tongs, as Frank Simon used to say. So I think that drama is the first step to really bringing out the magic of a Sousa march. And then in addition to that, it's just making sure that you never lose sight of how important the articulation and the accents are, that every note can have a little bit of a different emphasis depending on what you see in those parts, and bringing out those little accents that are written in there, bringing out the kind of melodic shape and the articulation that is naturally inspired by that melodic shape really brings these marches to life. It makes them leap off the page. And if you're going at a slightly slower tempo, it makes it easier for the musicians also to do some of those things and to dig in to some of those little micro expressions that are the things that separate Sousa from so many other march composers.
All right. So I guess the next thing, my community band director would this always comes up every summer when we play Stars and Stripes Forever. Do you slow down at any point in Stars and Stripes Forever?
Okay, so the thing that I am certain of is that Sousa never would have done the last strain of any march to include the Stars and Stripes Forever slower than any part of the march.
Right.
So when Sousa writes Grandioso, he does not write it as a tempo indication. He writes it as a style indication.
Mm-hmm.
So we never do the last strain of Stars and Stripes slower.
Mm-hmm.
What we do execute often is a little bit of a retard into the very last time through. And I think that's okay. It's not necessarily what Sousa would have done every time, but I think a little bit of that retard traditionally is okay, as long as that there is a clear and disciplined a-tempo right when you get to the downbeat of the last 32 bars. So that is the rule of thumb. Don't slow down. Don't play the last strain slower. You can do a little bit of a retard, but then jump right back into the main tempo.
Right. This is always a point of contention.
Well, you just heard definitive word from the director of the Marine Band.
I guess so. So a little tongue in cheek about this a little bit earlier, but I do want to ask you, because we talked about authenticity with the Sousa marches. What has it been like to sort of like go back historically, and did you notice any trends that had changed over the past 100 years since Sousa's day that had to be sort of adjusted after looking historically at the marches?
Yes and no. I mean, there are two answers to your question. The first thing that's been so fascinating for me is to trace Sousa's development from the very beginning of his compositional career, 1873, when he released Review, his first march, and going through to the 1930s now, where he is just a full-fledged master at the march form. Watching that evolution as a composer has been fascinating to see when he finally settled on the march form, the long or short trio form that we're familiar with, or the patrol form, the medley form. He had like 4 or 5 different forms, but he basically then settled on those and did that over and over again for the rest of his career because he had perfected it. So watching him kind of have that light bulb go off as we've gone through this project has been really fascinating. As far as the performance practice, I think what I've learned is that a lot of stuff has been added over the years to Sousa's performance practice, and in some cases to the arrangements. We have a lot of even early arrangements from the 1920s, 1930s that even during Sousa's life, where parts were added, second flute parts with harmony were added, alto clarinet parts were added, and it was musical material that did not exist in the manuscripts and that Sousa did not write. And so we have tried really hard as we've gone through this whole project to pare down the parts to what we can be reasonably sure Sousa composed himself. So no added counter melodies and trios, no trumpet fanfares that sometimes have been added in, no extra harmony parts that were added by publishers later on. So we've actually eliminated some parts that in some cases the Marine Band has been playing for many, many years, but are not authentic to Sousa. And so these recordings that you're hearing as part of our series, they represent kind of as close to what we believe Sousa would have had in his original pieces as can be determined. And so, I think in some ways the marches have gotten simpler from a musical material perspective because we pared away all that extraneous stuff just to what the master wrote himself. And that's cleared out some space to add even more nuance to the way we perform them and even more dynamic contrast and those accents and articulation style, expressive style elements that I was talking about earlier. And you can hear them because the music is very pure. It's really what he originally intended that we are trying to execute and trying to capture.
Remember your first term of teaching? Learning all the skills that you don't get taught in music school, managing a transitioning culture in your classroom, finding out that you have to teach guitar this term? During those early years, we found out that leaning on a community of music educators was important, not only for building that knowledge in ourselves, but also maintaining enough sanity to serve the students right in front of us. Amused is a podcast centered around a community of music teachers. Between the four of us, we teach choir, band, orchestra, general, jazz, and marching band at the elementary through collegiate levels. We certainly don't have all the answers, but you're welcome to listen in while we try to find them. Join us while we work through the challenges of music teaching and celebrate the joy of bringing music making into the lives of young people. In each episode, you'll hear stories, both good and bad, about that week of teaching, and we'll try and tackle an issue that one of us is struggling with. Something we're all taught is that music brings people together, but being the only teacher in your subject at a site can be really isolating. We think everyone ought to be a part of a community, and you're welcome to come join ours. Episodes come out on Wednesdays during the school year, and you can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at amusedcast.org.
Jason, I think it's time to go on to our final questions here. I could talk to you all day. There's a lot to talk about. But let me ask you.
Well, same here. Thank you very much.
I have a group of questions that I ask of all the guests on my show, and it kind of creates
Okay.
I don't know what I want to say, a common reference for the listeners so they kind of hear it from everybody. But they're philosophical questions kind of about what we do in the band community and career questions kind of things. So let me start with the first one, and it's where do you draw the line between healthy and unhealthy competition in music?
Wow, this is a tricky topic. And I'll start off by saying I don't think competition in music is necessarily a bad thing. And part of the reason is because competition is inherent in every musical career. When you take an audition, you're competing against other people for a job. And for a position. So, when you're in an ensemble, you're competing against others for musical opportunities and for positions within an organization. So you can't eradicate competition from music. And I think bands who go to competitions, you're training to some degree for that reality. And I accept that. I do think that it can become unhealthy. I think when the competition becomes only about winning, and that we lose sight of what we're actually doing together, i.e. making music and creating together, I think that's when it becomes unhealthy. If you lose a competition and you can't get past the fact that you've lost or you've gotten a rating that is lower than you wanted, and you forget all of the work and all of the things that you did to just be at the competition, then we have failed, I think, as musicians and as leaders and as teachers. If you're working toward a goal to achieve together and you're accomplishing something together, and I know it sounds cliche, but if you get to the end of that process and you accept that whether we win or lose, it doesn't matter. We've had so much fun working together and making this thing together, and we've learned so much doing it, then I think the competition is fine because it's secondary to the process of actually making music. And if you win and if it makes you feel even better about your ensemble and the work you've put in, wonderful, but that's not the point.
So the next question is particularly difficult for music teachers, especially band directors who work long hours because they love what they do and they identify with their job. But how have you found a work-life balance in your career as a musician?
Well, to be honest with you, Mark, I'm not sure I have. It's very tricky, I think, certainly for teachers who are asked to do a lot more than it says on their contracts and on paper. And the good teachers give everything they have to their students and to their programs. And there's really no way around that if you're passionate about what you do. It's the same thing, certainly in my career and our career as military musicians. And as director, you might imagine I need to be available all the time. I am charged with not just taking care of the United States Marine Band for my short chapter here as director, but I'm charged with taking care of 154 people and their families. And I spend a lot of time thinking about them and thinking about what's best for them and for their health and for their professional success and for the safety and health of their families, especially in a time like we have right now, which is unprecedented. And I spent the majority of my time, I'm not studying scores right now, I'm thinking about how to take care of my Marines, which is a big part of my job. So I think that finding the balance is tricky. I have worked to try to find the balance between those professional responsibilities and my own obligations to my family and my own self-care. I think I'm getting better at it than I maybe was 10 years ago when I didn't have as much experience or as much confidence to do to make the decisions that I have to make now. I still am not 100% confident about every decision I make, but I certainly have been there and done that a little bit, enough to be able to feel like I can pull myself away from that enough to give back to my family and take care of my home responsibilities. But it is a challenge. It's a daily challenge of my job and the job of many professionals across our country. I think you have to make dedicated time and be disciplined to force yourself to unplug for certain times so that you can take care of those you love and take care of yourself, frankly, which can get lost in the shuffle too if you're not careful.
Yeah, I forgot at the beginning of the episode to mention that, these are usually downloaded asynchronously. So I should mention for the listeners that Colonel Fettig and I are recording on early April of 2020. And so we have the COVID-19 pandemic is spreading throughout the country. And so that's what we're referencing. Yeah. So Colonel Fettig, let's talk about that for just a moment. How has that affected what you're doing right now, since it's all on our minds?
Yeah, I mean, as you can imagine, just like everyone else, especially in our profession, it's affected us pretty greatly. We're not in a position where we can share music in person with people, either in ceremony, at the White House, or in concert, which is what we would typically be doing. Our staff continues to work and our musicians continue to work in whatever way they can to share the institution with as many people as we can. I mean, we are active duty Marines, and so it is important that idea of service, even in a crisis, is forefront in our minds. So we are in the middle right now of a whole process of finding creative ways to reach out to the public. One of the ways we've done it is through educational outreach. We have dozens and dozens of our musicians engaged in master classes and online Q&A sessions with digital classrooms all across the country right now, and that's only going to increase, I think, in the coming weeks. We're putting out a call, actually, for educators who might be interested in having a visit from one of our musicians or from me or one of our directors to their classes as they are struggling to come up with their curriculums while at home. We definitely want to continue to provide that. I mean, we have wonderful resource here, and it's a big part of our artistic mission is to be involved in education and to be a resource to our colleagues across the field. And then performances, there's been a lot of performances that have been recorded in safe environments from home and little kind of musical vignettes and musical moments that we are posting on social media. And we're working on a couple of other larger ensemble type things that are done bit by bit that we can put together and share with people to maybe brighten their day a little bit. We're going to continue to do that as long as we're in this period of isolation, continue to get the word out about the power of music and to share the resources of this band with as many people as we can while they're sequestered in their homes as well.
Well, I want you to know that my middle schoolers are watching a video of the Marine Band every week and then giving me recording video comments back about your performances and what they observe that their instrument's doing. And so you're certainly in my classroom right now.
That's so great. Thank you, Mark, for using those resources. And do let us know if there's anything that we can do to help provide additional resources for you as you weather the storm.
Absolutely. All right, well, let's get back to these questions. And then at the end, I'm going to ask you for your contact information for folks who want to know how to do that.
Okay.
All right. And so, Jason, what are the challenges that you think are facing music education or the band community as we move forward into the 21st century and beyond?
The good news first, I think, and there's a lot of good news. First of all, I think that students are participating in band programs at a higher rate than I've ever seen. The band programs in public schools and in colleges are thriving, as they should be, and it has continued to be a major source of music education across our country. And I'm so grateful for that. I mean, there's so many composers that are writing for band and choosing specifically to write for band because of the opportunities they have to collaborate with student musicians and professional musicians and opportunities to share their music across a wide variety of platforms. I think in that sense, our educational community is very healthy, and I think it's very collaborative, and those opportunities are endless for people who play a wind instrument and want to be involved in these ensembles. I think where I worry about our profession is kind of what happens next. How can we continue to make sure that band music specifically is relevant in today's society? The world is changing so rapidly, and modes of entertainment and of artistic expression are changing and diversifying, and live performance is something that is so important, but I think it can take a back seat to all the digital opportunities that people have right now. And I want to make sure that we do whatever we can to make sure that live performance, live collaboration between musicians and audiences stays a unique experience that cannot be supplanted by anything else in the digital world. I mean, we do a lot of digital stuff, obviously. We're doing it right now. We're sharing almost everything we do on this wonderful technology we have, but it does not replace the live interaction between real people performing in real time for other real people and having them enjoy it. So I want to make sure we stay relevant in sharing band music with the public. And one of the ways that has become really clear to me in my job here is how important audiences are, how important it is to interact and relate to audiences. We don't live in a vacuum. We don't perform in a vacuum. I don't think that we can always just play programs for the sake of an educational goal or just kind of play them for ourselves. And I think one of the things that I hope will continue to happen in education programs from all the way from elementary school through college is teaching musicians, young musicians, not only how to be great musicians, but how to relate to their audiences, how to interact with their audiences, how to bring audiences inside of their world so they know that this is a very personal and a very intimate art that we share. That programs and initiatives by musicians are designed to cultivate new audiences and to be empathetic to the audiences we already have, to make them want to come to a performance so that they're not just seeing and hearing a performance, but they're getting an experience with you as an artist. We try to do a lot of that in our work in the Marine Band, and I think it makes a huge difference. People like to get to know people as much as they like to get to know your music, and those two things are they go hand in hand. They're intertwined in a musician in the 21st century, in my opinion.
Jason, if I had a time machine and I could set it to the day of your high school graduation, what advice would you give yourself?
Well, I would probably have gotten a different haircut than I had when I was a senior in high school. I think this goes to, any student who is preparing for a career or doing something you love, but you're just not sure what the future holds. It can be really scary. I think, none of us can predict the future. And, the whole point of this question is, what could you tell yourself now that you know what you know?
Yeah.
I suppose I would have told myself to have faith. That I was doing the right things, that if I was being honest about my work and my seriousness to practicing and to doing well in school, to becoming the best citizen I could be, that I was going to be okay, that I was going to have a career that I was going to enjoy, I was going to be successful. It may not have been in the way that I planned, but I was going to be successful in some way. I think it would have been nice to have a little less anxiety about what the future holds and a little more confidence that everything was going to work out. And I think I would also tell my younger self, and I did this a little bit, but I could have done it even more, to seize the day. This is something my high school band director, Dave Bresnahan, would tell us all the time. Carpe diem, seize the day. And I took his advice in some areas and I didn't take it in others because I was a little scared. I was a little nervous. I was a little fearful of failure and of being judged. If I could go back, I would have seized more of those opportunities. I would have been more fearless and just taking advantage of things that came my way, not being worried about what the consequences would be, because the consequences were never going to be as bad as I thought they were going to be. And the rewards could have been wonderful. Now, I got lucky that I seized some opportunities that led me to where I am today, but I would have done even more of that if I knew then what I know now.
Absolutely. I think it's also important that sometimes our fear of failure can sometimes turn into fear of success.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think, you be careful what you wish for.
Right.
I certainly experienced that myself. When I first became an assistant director, I didn't expect it. And all of a sudden I was thrown into a world that I was unprepared for and didn't know if I could do it. And that was pretty scary too. So it can happen both ways. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, it's every time I start to write a new piece of music, it's like I feel like I have to live to the last one, even though that's a false premise. It still is something that I deal with. I think a lot of creative people have that issue too.
Yep.
All right. So, Colonel Fettig, if you had a choice, what would be the final work for wind ensemble or band that you'd want to conduct or perform?
You mean before my death?
Yeah, like the last one. So not necessarily that's like on your deathbed, but you're going to not perform or conduct again.
Wow, that is a difficult question, Mark. Of course, I've had the privilege of conducting thousands of pieces of music at this point in my career. Can I choose two? And I'll tell you why.
Absolutely.
I think one of the pieces I would want to conduct is Mozart's Grand Partita. And it's because that's really in many ways where it all began for us. Being in this organization with a history of 220 years, I have such love and respect and just passion for the history of where we've come from. Those who have come before us, how we have gotten to where we are today, how the music has evolved for us, and how we can be professional band people, and teachers, and have this be a career. And Mozart's Grand Partita, not only is Mozart just an amazing composer in every way, but that wind ensemble piece, that's 50-minute, very serious wind ensemble piece, which was very unusual for that time, I really think in many ways that's where it began for us. I mean, Mozart gave us the right to be called a band. And it's such a beautiful piece of music. I would love to go back to the beginning as my last act on this earth as a band conductor, just to celebrate that piece one more time. And then if I could pick a contemporary piece, because this is a state of our state of art is constantly evolving. It's constantly being grown. And one of the things that I hope I can leave behind when I finish with my career here is that I have added something to that process and that initiative. And so we've done a lot of commissioning in the Marine Band, and we're doing even more than we've ever done starting now. I have actually about 8 commissions in the works for the next 3 years already. But some of the pieces that I've commissioned, I've really been very proud of the way that the band has performed them and the collaborations we've had with composers. And the one I think I'm most proud of so far is James Stevenson's Second Symphony, Symphony Number 2, which we premiered at the Midwest Clinic in 2016. And I'd want to conduct that piece toward the end of my time as a band conductor, because I felt very close to the collaborative process that gave it birth, which I'm very proud of, but also because of the nature of the piece. If you read about the symphony, it's a very personal work from Jim, and there's an emotional arc to that piece that is very satisfying and very moving. And the way it ends is kind of like an apotheosis of life, an apotheosis of why we're all here. And I can't think of anything more appropriate, if that were going to be the way I finished my music making, to relive that musical moment one more time as well.
This is usually the point of the show where I ask if there's anything coming up that you'd like to share or promote, but you are the director of the President's Own, and we are in the middle of the COVID-19 crisis. So probably maybe not the best question right now.
Well, I would say that for band directors all across the country who don't necessarily have a chance to hear the Marine Band live on a regular basis, except when we're on our tours, we try to get around the country once every 5 years. But most of the stuff I would promote is actually online. So this is actually the perfect time amidst this crisis for people to explore a lot of the things that are available as resources on our website, on our YouTube page, on our Facebook page. And the things I would promote are some of the things that we have already talked about. Certainly the Sousa project. I mean, I want as many people as possible to be able to tap into this resource, to honor the heritage of John Philip Sousa, to use these editions and these recordings as an example and as a pedagogical tool for their students, to help teach Sousa and to just enjoy this wonderful music. And then beyond that, we videotape so many of our concerts, and we have so many educational videos on our YouTube page that this is a perfect way to be able to connect with the Marine Band in concert, to get repertoire ideas, to come up with lesson plans using all of those materials that exist. So I would encourage everybody just to check out our website and check out our YouTube page, and just maybe find some things that would be exciting to them, or perhaps useful for their teaching.
Yeah, and this is a good opportunity to remind directors who are listening that because the Marine Band is a government ensemble, that these are copyright-free recordings as well.
Right.
And so
everything that you have available as a resource for us is done free of charge. Mm-hmm. And for Sousa, we've only been able to publish the public domain marches that we have. Right. But there's over 100 of them there, so there's plenty to work through before you run out of material.
Sure. All right, Jason. So you mentioned some resources. How could people get in touch with you or the Marine Band?
Well, I think the best way to get in touch with me and or the band as a whole is just to go to our website and send an email to the inbox for the Office of Communication. I get a lot of emails that come to me through that inbox, and my staff forwards them up to me. So I will read emails that come in. And if they're emails for just in a general sense or notes for other people, that's the central location that they can be sent. We have a wonderful communications staff that is on the ball, and a social media management staff. And they're really great about responding to people who write in with a question or with a request.
Jason, thank you for your service. Thank you for what you do for the band community. And thanks for being a guest on the show. I really appreciate it.
Mark, it's been my great pleasure to talk to you. I feel like we're in your living room just having a conversation about music. And I really appreciate the invitation to share some of my background and share some stories about the band. And this is a wonderful resource for our colleagues all across the nation.
Well, thank you.